And again, I'm quoting directly from Meredith's report. The agent told her, "We don't advertise that apartment because then we would have to respond to everyone who inquires. But we're just looking for people with quiet lifestyles who work, not CEOs necessarily, but people with good jobs." So by the end of the test, it was very clear what he meant by that, because Meredith was the only tester who got told about the secret apartment. The other 3 testers, it was never mentioned to them. But Meredith, the real life Meredith, who was a law student here at the time, I will never forget Meredith coming to my office to debrief after she wrote her report. And the first thing she said was, "Wow, I have white privilege." I mean, it was so obvious to her that this agent was going above and beyond to garner her favor and to give her special treatment.
Good evening and welcome. I am delighted that you have joined the Fort Hall Forum for this evening's program. Qualified renters need not apply, race and voucher discrimination in the Metro Boston housing market, with members of the Suffolk University Housing Discrimination Testing Program. This is a powerful and important study, which addresses race and voucher discrimination, as well as housing access, which is critical for the health and safety of our citizens. The coronavirus pandemic has underscored the ties between housing and health and has laid bare systemic racism and inequality in America. This study offers further evidence of the entrenchment of discrimination and the unequal application of rights, with its close examination of Boston's housing practices. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Soni Gupta. Soni has served as the Director of Neighborhoods and Housing at the Boston Foundation since 2018. Prior to her appointment, she was the Executive Director of Home Funders Collaborative. Soni has deep knowledge of affordable housing development and finance, as well as firsthand experience with what actually takes to successfully develop and sustain housing for very low-income families. With that, let me turn it over to you, Soni.
Our presenters and panelists this evening are all from Suffolk University Law School, and 4 are also affiliated with its Housing Discrimination Testing Program, or HDTP, an acronym you should become familiar with this evening. HDTP is a full-service fair housing center that engages in testing, education and outreach, enforcement, curriculum development, and academic studies. HDTP has conducted hundreds of housing discrimination tests, published groundbreaking empirical studies, brought thousands of dollars in damages to victims of discrimination, trained thousands in their fair housing rights and responsibilities, and is training the next generation of civil rights attorneys. Jamie Langowski and Catherine LaRaia will present the study and its findings. Jamie, whose pronouns are she, her, is a clinical fellow at Suffolk University Law School and assistant director of HDTP. Attorney Langowski has many years of experience in the area of fair housing law and helped started the HDTP program at Suffolk. She's co-developed and co-taught multiple experiential fair housing law courses and is a frequent speaker on topics related to fair housing testing. Catherine LaRaia is a clinical fellow and director of investigations and outreach at HDTP. Attorney LaRaia develops and implements testing to detect housing discrimination and works with enforcement and legal service agencies to investigate discrimination complaints. In addition, Attorney LaRaia coordinates testing related to systemic audits and larger research initiatives. Ana Vaquerano, a native of El Salvador, is a long-term resident of Chelsea who has worked tirelessly for the community for over 25 years. Ana has worn many hats in her work with Suffolk University Law School: program coordinator, administrative assistant, secretary receptionist, paralegal, and intake worker, among other responsibilities. She's been honored for her outstanding client service by the Massachusetts chapter for the National Lawyers Guild, and also by many other organizations. Her dedication to public service is an example and an inspiration to her colleagues and the students of Suffolk University Law School. William Berman is clinical professor of law at Suffolk University Law School, where he has taught for 20 years. He co-founded and is the director of Suffolk's HDTP. Professor Berman and his clinical students have represented hundreds of indigent tenants in housing discrimination, eviction, and other housing-related matters. He and his colleagues have trained thousands of students and community members in fair housing law. And to round out our presenters and panelists, James Matthews is a practitioner in residence at Suffolk Law School's Accelerator to Practice program and HTTP, where he supervises law students in housing discrimination, landlord tenant, and other consumer protection matters related to housing. Attorney Matthews has over 10 years of experience working with low-income individuals on housing issues, and during law school, he continued advocating for at-risk tenants through a summer fellowship at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau and as a student attorney in Suffolk University's Law School Housing Clinic. Great to have you all this evening. So Jamie and Catherine, I'll now turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Soni. HDTP is primarily funded by grants from HUD. Any views expressed here are the HDTP's views alone. We conducted an investigation funded by the Boston Foundation into the levels of race and voucher discrimination in Greater Boston from August 2018 to July 2019. In Massachusetts, it is illegal to discriminate against source of income, that is, holding a government subsidy like Section 8. And it's illegal to discriminate against race under both Massachusetts law and federal law. But we routinely see both kinds of discrimination in our day-to-day investigations. And source of income is one of the most commonly occurring types of discrimination we uncover. Knowing that racism is a problem that plagues our nation and our state, and knowing that Boston is extremely segregated, we suspected that there were higher rates of race-based discrimination than what we were capturing in our routine testing. We suspected that people were discriminating against source of income as a proxy for race. And while the majority of voucher holders in Massachusetts are actually white women, we know that people hold certain prejudices and assumptions about voucher holders. We suspected that people were more comfortable saying outright, we can't rent to you because of your voucher, than we won't rent to you because of your race. So we developed testing methodology to pull apart these variables, race and source of income, to unpack what was actually happening in the rental market. In order to assess whether discrimination was happening and against whom, we would have to send white and black testers to the same apartment to compare their experience. By the same token, we would need to send voucher holders and non-voucher holders or market rate tenants to that same apartment. By collaborating with Analysis Group, an international economic consulting firm, we determined that we would need to test 50 sites to generate statistically significant data. Therefore, we would need to send 4 testers to 50 units. HDTP recruited and trained 200 individual testers for the study. 100 testers were white, and of the 100 white, 50 were assigned vouchers and 50 were market rate prospective tenants. The other 100 testers were black people, whose 50 of those were voucher holders and 50 of those were market rate. So 1 black market rate, 1 white market rate, 1 white voucher holder, and 1 black voucher holder would each contact the same apartment, try to tour the unit, and write a report about their experience. HDTP and Analysis Group then compared the 4 testers' reports for each of the 50 tests and assessed what patterns of treatment emerged within a single test and ultimately across all 50 tests. Each tester was given a profile that included the basic information that might be exchanged while interacting with the contact person listed in the advertisement, or as we say, the housing provider. All 4 testers in a single test were the same sex. They were all assigned similarly good credit scores and rental histories. Everyone was employed. All the properties tested were in the Greater Boston area, accessible by bus and train, and all the units were within the voucher payment standards. We provided price, size, and geographical limits to Analysis Group, and they in turn provided us with weekly randomized apartment listings that met our criteria. Other protected classes, such as families with children, were not introduced. Everyone was single and looking for a 1-bedroom or a studio unit. All testers presented as cisgender, had no visible disabilities, and did not have an accent that could be suggestive of birth outside the US. Testers were assigned names that indicated their race based on prior academic research. Names such as Ebony, Jamal, and Aisha were assigned to Black people, and names like Brad, Jill, and Meredith for white people. Testers were trained to introduce themselves with their assigned name during every interaction with housing providers. Additionally, testers with vouchers were instructed to introduce their vouchers over the phone during their first conversation with the housing provider. With these parameters in place, we plan to simulate what a real housing search would look like for someone in each of these 4 groups. Each tester contacted the person listed in the advertisement. In the vast majority of cases, this person was a real estate agent. And each tester expressed interest in the advertised unit. Every tester over the phone, again, introduced their race-indicating name and their voucher if relevant. And then we ended the test at the application stage. We did not have the testers submit an actual application. They did not go beyond the point of getting a tour and requesting an application. Collectively, these 200 testers gathered evidence about what information was given, what information was asked of them, and whether they were able to make an appointment and ultimately tour the unit. Now I'll hand the same things off to Jamie Langowski to discuss what we found.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the findings, but first I want to acknowledge that we aren't just talking numbers and statistics here. These numbers represent lived experience for many people, and they can be difficult to hear. Next slide, please. So we found a lot of differences in treatment related to who was able to make an appointment, who got ghosted, meaning all communication was just stopped with the tester, even as they continuously left messages, and how many apartments people were told about. The HDTP team looked at the data and found evidence of discrimination based on housing voucher in 86% of the tests and race-based discrimination in 71% of the tests. And then we gave analysis group all 200 tester reports, and they prepared the data for statistical analysis. AG identified and defined 44 outcome variables from those reports. And variables included things like whether the tester was invited to tour the housing site or whether an application was offered to the tester. AG analyzed differences in outcomes between the 4 tester groups and by race and voucher status using methods to gather statistically significant data, which means that what we found can be generalized for the broader market, and we feel confident that this is representative of what is happening when people are engaged in a real housing search. So overall, AG's analysis supported the HDTP's review of that data, and we concluded that voucher discrimination was actually not a proxy for race discrimination. The data instead showed that there are very high levels of discrimination based on both race and voucher status. And so I'm going to go through and highlight a few of these key statistically significant findings that we found. And as you can see on this slide, and as Catherine discussed, tests were designed so that race or voucher status would be revealed as early as possible in the interaction. And we found that discrimination began occurring before testers even had the opportunity to see the unit. Results indicate that testers were significantly more likely to be ghosted, so to suddenly receive no contact without any explanation if they had a housing voucher. And the chart on this slide shows that the voucher testers were ghosted at a rate 4 times higher than their non-voucher counterparts, with 42% of voucher testers being ghosted compared to only 10% of the non-voucher testers. Another way in which discrimination can occur in the housing search process is when people tour an apartment and interact with the person giving the tour. And as shown on this slide, data from the study showed that white non-voucher testers, represented by the bar on the far right of the slide, they were able to view apartments at a much higher rate than Black non-voucher testers, with 80% of white non-voucher testers able to view the apartment compared to only 48% of Black non-voucher testers. Regardless of their race, voucher testers had even less opportunity to tour apartments, and Black voucher testers were able to view apartments only 18% of the time, while white voucher testers were able to view apartments only 12% of the time. We also found that housing providers told Black and voucher testers about fewer available apartments than their white and non-voucher counterparts. Specifically, white non-voucher testers on average were informed that there were over twice as many units available as Black non-voucher testers. And testers with a voucher were told even fewer units were available, with white non-voucher testers being informed of 5 to 6 times as many units as voucher testers of either race. The number of apartments actually shown to testers demonstrates a similar pattern. On average, white non-voucher testers were shown twice as many units as Black non-voucher testers. And again, we see that testers with a voucher were shown fewer units than testers without a voucher. The last thing that I would like to highlight is that the study was designed to mimic a real housing search that people would engage in. And testers were assigned and responded to rental advertisements of units that fit the parameters of the study. Studio, one bedrooms that ranged from $1,378 to $1,563 per month. And we found that the majority of the time, testers ultimately interacted with real estate professionals, meaning someone who was working on behalf of someone else. So as you can see on this slide, 187 testers interacted with real estate professionals. Only 14 interacted with property owners and 4 interacted with property management personnel. Now this totals more than 200 because in some instances, testers would be referred to other people by their first contact in order to continue the process. It's important to remember that on paper, all testers were equally qualified to rent, but many testers were screened out and never given the opportunity to demonstrate their qualifications. In the Metro Boston rental housing market, real estate professionals are in a position to either maintain the status quo or disrupt it and help create change.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Jamie. That was a powerful and succinct presentation on a complex testing study and careful analysis. I know that the overall process took more than a year, so thank you for that terrific presentation. And I'd like to turn to Ana first to help draw out some of the connections between the research findings and the impacts of COVID-19 in her community of Chelsea. We know that discrimination by race and voucher use impacts the very households that the voucher program was designed to assist. And for families who remain without vouchers despite being eligible for them, when they're unable to use the voucher due to discrimination, living in unsafe housing or moving frequently can directly affect the health of adults and children in these households. And nowhere has this been more apparent than in Chelsea, where COVID case rates have been in the highest in the state. And we know that social determinants of health were responsible for this disproportionate impact, where there's crowding in the homes due to unaffordability. There's a higher share of frontline workers who risk infection every day by going to jobs to provide essential services. And it's an environmental justice community where years of exposure to poor air quality actually correlates with more severe COVID symptoms. So Ana, I understand you're not only the intake coordinator for the testing program and the accelerator practice, but you also are a longtime resident of the city of Chelsea. Can you tell us what it has been like in the city of Chelsea during the pandemic and the hardships that the pandemic has caused for particular households in Chelsea?
Thank you, Soni. We have been going through difficult times in the last 6 months in Chelsea. Chelsea is a small city, very crowded, and it's a city of immigrants. Chelsea has an infection rate very high, more than any other state in the Commonwealth. And with families in overcrowded housing, it has been very difficult to contain the spread. Many residents in Chelsea and family members have lost their jobs, get infected with the virus. Some of them even lost their lives through this pandemic. But a lot of people had passed away because of COVID in the city of Chelsea. Every day, I receive calls through the intake line. That is the reason I can tell you, by experience that I get all these calls of people and I can see what is going on with the community. Residents of Chelsea, I believe it was impacted by the virus, and we are the epicentric of the pandemic in Massachusetts. It's because many people continue to do the essential work. They have to go to work. They never stop working. They were working through the pandemic. They have to take transportation, and as doing the essential jobs, they used to work in markets and all the food, industry. And, but the most I will say is the overcrowded housing. Many tenants, they are forced to share their homes with other families because rent is very expensive in Chelsea. And when one of the tenants in this apartment get the virus, you know, every housemate in that apartment get the virus. And that is how it got, you know, spread to too many people, because people are forced to share an apartment. And I think that is one of the reasons Chelsea was hit very hard. Also, this community is we have a lot of undocumented people, and they are very afraid. You know, they are very afraid to seek for benefits, for help going to the hospital, because they are afraid to be deported. That's very hard for them. And many of them, they don't have a health insurance. And that is something that, you know, is very sad, but that is happening. And that happened in Chelsea. I had a neighbor that he didn't have a health insurance. He was undocumented. He got the virus. I remember talking to him twice, go to the doctor, go to the doctor. And then his answer was, I am afraid. You know, I don't want immigration to know that I'm here. And then plus I don't have an insurance. If they call the ambulance, you know, it's gonna be $1,500, so I don't have that money. When he went to the hospital, it was too late. You know, his lungs were already damaged. And, you know, he passed away, and it's only 2 doors from my house. That's what is going on in Chelsea. You know, an example of cases that I have seen, I can tell you so many, because that is part of my job, to be listening to people. So when people call, I am the first person who listens to them. And so I, you know, all the cases are very sad, but some of them impact my life. And I remember talking to this woman who called us, and because she was very afraid to be evicted. Her husband worked in one of the markets here in this city, and you know, he was the only source of income in the house. They pay $1,700 for rent, and the husband got the virus. He was in intensive care, you know, in the hospital. And James and I, because she doesn't speak English, that's another reason people don't go anywhere, because of the language. So James and I called her, 3-way call, and, you know, we were surprised the way she was afraid. You know, she had this baby, this newborn baby. She wasn't working. You know, she was living on charities, on food. I remember going to her house many, many times to drop food, gift cards, and I was calling her to see how she was doing. James and I called her a few times to make sure that she was okay, that she wasn't afraid, that the landlord was coming and put her on the street with the baby. And, you know, those cases, we have so many. Finally, the last time that I spoke with her, I was so happy to hear that her husband was okay. She was back home after 6 weeks in intensive care. Another case that, you know, I told Bill, that person, she called also the intake line. And I remember her face, but I don't recall her name or anything, because I saw her face. She was so afraid, so scared. I passed by to drop a gift card, and it was a surprise to me, because she was coming by the back door with stairs coming down. And she told me that everybody, 8 people living in the house, 1 bathroom in that apartment, 3-bedroom apartment. She was, you know, everybody got the virus, and she was locked into this small room with her 3 children. You know, they couldn't go out. They were so afraid to be infected with the virus. And she was telling me, you know, Ana, when I go to the bathroom, we have to go all 4 of us together, because I have to clean up. I have to make sure that my children are okay, you know, and cases like that, we have so many cases, you know. James and I have called a lot of people because they are afraid, they don't know the eviction process, but after talking to us, they feel like relief. And then we call back a few people after the moratorium law, so to tell people, and at least, you know, to be happy because they won't, you know, be evicted for now. And, you know, that's what we have been doing. You know, I was talking to my husband that there was a time that I know so many people, so many cases, so many people that I know, so many family members that got the virus, that my husband, after work, you know, I never stopped working. I was working all the time. So, but after 5, I start cooking. I start going out. Take me to Riviera. Take me to this. Take me to Everett. Take me. You know, he was like a taxi driver, taking me to different places to try to help the community. And that's what they're doing. And I know so many people in the community has been joined together. So, so people don't be that afraid. See that they have somebody backing them up. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear about your neighbor, Ana, and I can only imagine how grateful people are to have your voice listening to them when they do call. So thank you for everything that you do, both at Suffolk and in your community. And you talk about overcrowding. We know that only 1 in 4 households who are eligible for vouchers do end up getting a voucher. And yet here we are with them facing discrimination. I want to turn to Bill. Bill, do you see a connection between the type of discrimination that this study has uncovered and the heavier burden that communities of color, such as Chelsea, have borne as a result of the pandemic? Can you explain what you see as the connection?
Yes, thank you, Soni, and thank you, Ana, for telling us about your experience. Soni, you mentioned the social determinants of health. It's very important for people to draw the line between housing and housing discrimination and other things like health. And so that's just simply, what are the conditions like where you live, and how do they affect your health, educational and economic opportunities, and your general well-being? In certain communities, so Boston, as Jamie or Catherine mentioned at the top, is still a very segregated place. And the government played a role in creating that segregation with policies that they had in place, including redlining, where they controlled who would get loans, specific provisions in deeds that didn't allow people to sell to people of color. Those kinds of policies created segregation over a period of time. And then the government played a role in subjecting communities that were redlined, for example, to health conditions by locating, for example, heavy industry, highways, power plants, those kinds of things and concentrating them in those neighborhoods, so the people living there would also be exposed to health issues. There are studies that show that prolonged exposure to less good air is something that unfortunately increases the prevalence of getting COVID. And this is the kind of thing that you're seeing in Chelsea. Chelsea has the Tobin Bridge that brings a highway literally right through the center of it. It has the Mystic generating station in Everett. That's typically, you know, just a short distance, and the wind is blowing typically directly at Chelsea. They've got a huge salt pile. There's other environmental conditions there. And so as a result, people in the community have exposure to health conditions. As Ana was saying, a lot of the people in the community are also doing essential work. Another issue that we've had that segregation has created is lack of accumulation of wealth by people of color. A Fed study shows that the average white person in Boston has an average of net worth of nearly $150,000, while a Black person has a net worth of $8. And that is a very significant opportunity gap. And so as a result, people are having to work essential jobs, using public transportation. They're also living in overcrowded housing, which allows the virus to spread. A recent study showed that red-lined neighborhoods, unsurprisingly, are more prevalent in terms of the impact of COVID. And the Attorney General's office also released a brief based on data that the BU School of Public Health compiled that shows that communities of color have higher rates of COVID. So the lack of affordable housing and discrimination that we see, like we uncovered in our study, perpetuate this historic wrong and result in these negative health outcomes.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, for drawing the line between the practices of decades and what we're seeing as outcomes, both from the pandemic and related to the study. So I want to just step back for a minute here to help us get some context. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceived of this work? What were the research questions you were hoping to answer? And was there anything that surprised you in the results?
Yes, sure. We, as you know, do enforcement work, and we think it's very important to also do this kind of academic study because the types of work complement each other. So we see patterns in our enforcement work, and based on what we're seeing, and we saw for many years, very significant numbers of cases coming in with source of income or voucher discrimination. We wanted to say, okay, what is the actual prevalence? In order to know that, you have to do this kind of academic study that, as you mentioned, the testing alone took a year in order to do it. It's very important for policymakers to understand what's happening, and also prevents people from saying, oh, well, we don't have that here because it's never been looked at, so there's no evidence of it. So we knew there was high levels of voucher discrimination. We also see race discrimination as one of the top 4 types of discrimination. But as Catherine mentioned, it's much more difficult to detect, and people are less forward than they are about it, and it's more of a discrimination with a smile, and where sometimes the individuals feel like they've been treated well, but they don't know that their white counterparts are being treated much better. So we want to look at both source of income and race, and also the question that Catherine mentioned of whether voucher discrimination is an excuse for race discrimination. Or proxy. So what was surprising was that question, the answer was no. And the reason was the rate of discrimination, whether, no matter what your race is, for source of income, if you have a voucher, was so high, it's nearly impossible to discriminate against that individual anymore because they're in any other protected class. So 86% of the time, we see discrimination against someone who has a voucher. But it was also surprising to see race discrimination come back at such high rates and to see it throughout the process. And so people with race-associated names are even before anyone ever contacts them, they don't get contacted back at a certain rate, and then they get dropped. And if they get shown a place, they don't get treated as well. They don't get told or shown the same numbers of apartments, and they don't get the same types of positive comments, financial incentives, follow-up afterwards, even being offered an application. We saw differences. So all of those things were very surprising that they came back at the levels they did.
Thank you, Bill. Just speaking again of testers and the study, Catherine, did the testers typically realize that they'd been discriminated against? And what were their reactions themselves? And I know you documented anecdotes from the testing. Do they provide any examples of problematic conduct that you'd like to point out?
Thank you, Soni. Unfortunately, I have so many examples, and several of them really did indicate that the tester knew what was going on, because sometimes, unfortunately, it was just pretty clear. In one test, this was a test where the black tester was ghosted, but simply saying ghosted glosses over the full picture of what really happened to her. I'll refer to her by her tester name. She was a black market rate tester, and we assigned her the name Aisha. So in this particular instance, Aisha called the agent, and right away he asked for her credit score, and then he told her to call him back later. So Aisha called him back. He didn't reply. She called again the next day, asked to see the unit. He answered and said, look, this depends on you here. It all depends on you. She said she was free for the rest of the day. The agent asked, where do you live? What do you do for a living? And then got off the phone with her, told her to call back an hour later. So Aisha called back an hour later. When she did, the agent said, you got to stop calling me. Just don't call me. I'll text you. I'll have one of my guys text you, and got her off the phone. And Aisha wrote in her report, so I guess I'm not allowed to talk to him anymore. But she was a tester. She had a role to play. So over the next few days, she did call again, and she did text again, and she never was able to speak with the agent again. She didn't get to see the apartment. She knew this was a totally bizarre customer service experience, and I think she read the writing on the wall. But it was even more disturbing as the other tester reports came in. We found that the white market rate tester, we called her Jill, called the same agent within a matter of days. That agent gave her an appointment right away on the first phone call. He promptly followed up with her by text and to confirm the appointment. And then Jill toured the apartment. Jill got an application for the apartment. And Jill was never asked all of this about her credit score and where does she live and what her employment is. It just simply didn't happen to her. And Aisha, I think, even though she didn't know what happened with Jill, she could feel that this was not appropriate treatment. So testers in the study really often were aware that they were being discriminated against, and that it's not how we usually operate. We design our tests to leave the tester blind as to their role about what's being tested. However, when we assign them these names, I think it was really powerful. I think they became more attuned to what might be happening. In one of the slides Jamie shared, there were some quotes from a test, a different test, and in this one, the white market rate tester, we called her Meredith. And so Meredith got a tour. Meredith finished up the tour, was wrapping up the conversation, and the agent leaned into her and said, you know, I'd like you to invite you to see another apartment, to join a select group of people who are going to tour another unit. And again, I'm quoting directly from Meredith's report. The agent told her, we don't advertise that apartment because then we would have to respond to everyone who inquires. But we're just looking for people with quiet lifestyles who work, not CEOs necessarily, but people with good jobs. So by the end of the test, it was very clear what he meant by that, because Meredith was the only tester who got told about the secret apartment. The other three testers, it was never mentioned to them. But Meredith, the real life Meredith, who was a law student here at the time, I will never forget Meredith coming to my office to debrief after she wrote her report. And the first thing she said was, wow, I have white privilege. I mean, it was so obvious to her that this agent was going above and beyond to garner her favor and to give her special treatment. I've never seen so many testers walk back into my office and need to unpack what they've been through so much. Of course, I can't tell the tester what's happening with their counterparts, but again, it was pretty facially clear in many cases. Of course, the testers know that this is the work, this is why they're volunteering to help fight housing discrimination, but it's still a very tough thing when they adopt a persona and then they see that discrimination happened to them from that perspective. But regardless, there's just so many examples. I thank you for the opportunity to give some context to this, because we say ghosting, we say discrimination with a smile, but these stories in our report really give us an insight into how that looks and feels in real time.
Yeah, and I can imagine that was hard to process for the testers themselves, especially Aisha, having to deal with that kind of discrimination. And just sticking with the process of this, thank you, Catherine. Just keeping with the study itself, Jamie, I just have a question for you about the analysis. We know that there was an independent group called the analysis group that was involved. What was the difference between there and that their analysis as well as HDTP, and you had 200 testers. Why did you need so many, and was recruiting itself a challenge for that many testers?
Sure. So we engage in testing in our day-to-day work. We call that the enforcement testing. And with every single test that we do, we compare the experiences of the testers for any differences in treatment and whether we can attribute that difference to discrimination. And so we did that same sort of analysis that we do every single day with our enforcement testing in the research testing. And that's where we came up with our numbers of 86% of voucher holders experience discrimination and 71% of our race-based test experience discrimination. Analysis group examined all of the data together using statistical methods, and they looked for trends in the market in order to figure out what's happening just beyond, not just the test, but more broad. And they identified 44, I mentioned this, I think, up at the top, they identified 44 variables from our tester reports that they could compare for all 200 people. And then they looked at it based on who was market rate, who was voucher, they did it based on race. And so our two different types of analysis both found very high levels of discrimination. The difference with theirs is it was at the 95th and sometimes the 99th percent confidence level that yes, this is generalizable and this is what's happening in the broader market. And as for the sample size, the 50 test sites with 200 individual testers, we needed that many. We determined the number before we started testing at all. We worked with analysis group to figure out what the sample size should be in order to gather statistically significant data. And you really need individual people, because if you use the same 4 people repeatedly, you're really just gathering data about how those 4 people are treated in the market. And with so many different people, then we're able to account for factors like personality differences and things like that. Recruiting is always a challenge. That was a lot of people, but we're really fortunate that we already have a very large pool of people that are engaged in our day-to-day test work. And being in Metro Boston, we have access to a lot of people who are passionate about social justice, who want to volunteer for this type of work. But with needing 100 white and 100 Black gender conforming individuals with no visible disabilities, because we didn't want to introduce any other variables into the tests, we did at times need to recruit more people in order to meet that sample size. And yeah, I mean, we dug deep to do that, you know, at the local schools. We contacted our friends, colleagues, like anybody that we could, you know, get to help us out. And then, you know, we reached it. I mean, it did take us about a year to complete the testing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating process. You know, we think about testing as just gather up the people and send them out, and clearly it's a lot more complex than that. Thanks for sharing some of that detail, Jamie. James, I want to turn to you. We know that enforcement is a very critical service that HDTP offers, sort of the other side of discrimination, enforcement to help right the discrimination. Can you describe the work that you do? Were the study results consistent with what you're seeing on the enforcement side? And there's, I believe, one client of yours in particular who was discriminated against by a number of real estate professionals in the South Shore. And if you could share a little bit about that client's experience to bring that to life.
Sure, thanks, Soni. So as you mentioned, in addition to conducting academic research, we also enforce state and federal fair housing laws through testing and complaint-based investigations and by representing renters who have experienced discrimination. So I'm a supervising attorney in Suffolk's accelerator practice, which is a clinical program at the law school in which senior law students under the supervision of licensed attorneys assist victims of housing discrimination to file complaints in court and at local administrative agencies. So the accelerator practice really works very closely with the testing program so that when renters complain or suspect that they've been discriminated against during their housing search, and testing then later confirms that the housing provider has in fact engaged in discrimination, students in the accelerator and their supervisors can then pursue fair housing complaints on those tenants' behalf. And really the goal of those lawsuits is certainly to provide justice and dignity to renters who have been treated unfairly, but also to provide them with financial compensation to make them whole. And then also hopefully to hold housing providers accountable for violating the law and encourage them to change their discriminatory practices, both through training, but also to deter future discrimination. And so, I think unfortunately, the results of the study were consistent with what we're seeing in practice. We do get a lot of referrals from renters who have experienced discrimination based on source of income, but also based on race. And as Bill had mentioned earlier, we've known anecdotally for years that there are high levels of discrimination against those with vouchers. But I don't think we realized how pervasive the discrimination was until we saw the empirical results from the study. And sometimes renters will say, that they've encountered explicit discrimination. So, sorry, we don't take Section 8. But often we discover through testing that renters have experienced adverse treatment in more subtle ways, similar to how the testers in the study were treated. So, for example, that they won't get called back once they reveal that they have a voucher, or they're subjected to different customer service or application criteria, or given false information about the availability of an apartment. And I think our experience also has been that this type of hidden discrimination is particularly true for renters of color. And that might explain why we get fewer complaints of race-based discrimination, despite the high levels of racial discrimination that were uncovered by the study. And I think it's also, important to note that renters, especially those with vouchers, often decide not to pursue litigation because they're focused on trying to find a new apartment quickly in a short amount of time. And so they're not necessarily focused on suing the owner or the real estate agent who's not going to rent to them. And so unfortunately, that means that often the housing provider is never held accountable for breaking the law. And then in terms of the client that we were working with, I think her story offers a powerful example of how the type of discrimination that was revealed by the study impacts real families. So this is a single mother with 2 disabled children who was actively searching for a new home on the South Shore for over 2 years. And despite excellent qualifications, was continually turned away from rental properties by different real estate professionals because she has a voucher. And as you might imagine, this was an extremely frustrating and stressful time for her as she looked at literally dozens and dozens of properties. And the message that she was being that was being broadcast to her was that she didn't belong in the community where she had lived for over 20 years because she had a voucher. And so the testing program conducted an investigation, and that uncovered widespread housing discrimination in the South Shore. And just as an example, as part of that study, we tested 13 different South Shore real estate agents, several of which our client had been in contact with, and more than half of those agents were found to be discriminating against voucher holders, and in some cases also families with children. So we actually ended up referring that case to the Attorney General's office, who thankfully took on that case, continued the investigation, and initiated several separate enforcement measures against different real estate brokers and agents on the South Shore. We had also assisted the client in filing a complaint in housing court against one of the agents and the property owners. And so, the good news is that settlements in these cases will result in the tenant receiving over $40,000 in financial compensation, and also require many of the real estate agents to participate in fair housing training. So I think, those results underscore the importance of testing to uncover these types of often covert discriminatory practices, and also the value of enforcement to hold those offending housing providers responsible for their conduct.
Thank you, James. That's so incredibly troubling to hear about sort of the ongoing discrimination that this one mom faced, but also how widespread it was on the South Shore. And I can only imagine, and to hear something like "you don't belong," it's sort of hard to believe that this is in our time and age, that these are the very same things that people are still hearing. And you mentioned this, but I want to ask Bill or Jamie or both of you, How does the enforcement work inform the research and vice versa? James did touch on it, but from your point of view, how does this synergy work?
Sure. It really does fit together very nicely. We know from our enforcement work what is happening throughout the rental market in the area. And we take that knowledge and then we apply it to what research projects we want to look into, what we want to study. We also know from local analysis of impediments in the area and other reports that get published that consistently the top 4 most reported protected classes for discrimination in our area are race, familial status, meaning families with kids, disability, and people who are using housing vouchers. And so our day-to-day work shows us kind of how we might design studies and what we want to look into. And we took that knowledge and then we started drafting this project. And you have to do it, it's a little bit different for a research study than an enforcement test, but they go hand in hand. And one of the good things for us to come out of this is the tests that we ran for the study have really informed how we conduct our race-based tests in our day-to-day work now. We feel like we can do an even better job to capture what's actually going on and to design tests, because for us a successful test isn't to find discrimination, it's to uncover typical business practice. We're never trying to guide someone to act in a certain way. We want to know, how are you acting to people who present themselves, and then insert whichever protected class. And so the work really goes hand in hand, and they both inform each other. It's been a really helpful to us to do.
Can I add one thing?
Please, yes, Bill.
So, as you might imagine, it takes a long time and it's quite an expensive undertaking. And so I would also like to thank the Boston Foundation, for its support, and Analysis Group for offering their services. Some part of it was also finding issues that aligned with our funder and with Analysis Group that were important for the community. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Bill and Jamie. I mean, it's there was what's frightening about our world right now is there was an expectation of discrimination despite there being laws to protect against them, and it was the level of discrimination that continues to surprise and shock people. We've talked about the testing, we've talked about enforcement. I'd like to just touch on policy change, and I think a couple of questions relate to that as well. But turning back to you, Ana, what is it like in Chelsea now? It's the 6 months later since the start of the pandemic. And what do you think are the critical resources that households need and are being provided? You mentioned the moratorium, but what else?
Chelsea continues to have high rates of COVID-19 infection compared to other cities in the Commonwealth. I checked this morning and there were 9 confirmed cases just today. I believe things haven't changed much. And what we need, I would say that we need affordable housing, because what I think is had us all these many cases in the community is because, rent is very expensive and many tenants, they can't afford the rent. So they have to share an apartment with a relative, with a friend. So that is going to help a lot. I know the community and city officials have been working tireless to help everybody in need. But, there is always something else to do. But at the meantime, we don't fix the situation with housing. This is going to continue. People are still going to be afraid. What I can tell people is to do, everybody who's listening or can see us, what I will tell them to do their share, to continue to, I encourage everyone to continue to use, the distance, continue the physical distance, to cover your face, wash your hands, seek medical assistance if you need it. You know, forget about whether or not you're going to be, you know, able to pay the bills. Stay home if you feel that you are sick, and we have to stay vigilant. You know, you have to keep being informed of what is going on. I know that all of us together, we're going to get through this bedtime, and you know, what we need the most is affordable housing. And you know, what I can say is, God bless you and stay safe.
Thank you, Ana. Undoubtedly, we need more affordable housing, and people of Chelsea need more affordable housing, clearly. Staying with the theme of policy and, you know, Ana talking about the need for more housing. Bill, what policies can we put in place to ensure the people of color, Black households, brown households, can use, that are using these vouchers, have access to housing, equitable access to housing?
So we need more enforcement of existing policies. And then, for example, source of income, you mentioned people using vouchers, it's a protected class in Massachusetts, but it's not under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so right now, only 50 to 60% of jurisdictions even have source of income as a protected class. And, you know, it kind of, a voucher loses its promise if the people who are using it to try and find safe housing and for mobility are facing individuals who are actually allowed to discriminate against them in nearly half the country. So that's one area. I do think also just, and I'll expand this, you know, beyond housing. We need more transparency on the part of government in terms of data collection, and we need more studies of this kind, particularly around the impact of COVID and evictions and policing on people of color, because, you know, policy that's data-driven it can be better, more effective policy. We need to look at our real estate professionals, and we need to both encourage them to do better with training, because we exposed very serious issues with the broker community in Boston playing a role in discrimination. So the training should be increased and improved, but at the same time, penalties for brokers that engage in this kind of conduct need to be strengthened. The system that we currently have in place in Massachusetts is essentially, as far as I can tell, broken. And so, you know, I mentioned transparency. We tried to find out in the past couple of years how many brokers were suspended because of discrimination, and the board that keeps those records said, well, we don't keep data in that form. The law requires the MCAD, Mass Commission Against Discrimination, if there's a finding of discrimination, to refer brokers to that board. And the MCAD said, well, we can't find any indication that we've referred anyone. So that system is broken, and it needs to be fixed in a way that brokers know that if they do violate the law, they're going to lose their living. And once that happens, the culture can change, because part of it too is a cultural issue, and it's a larger issue that you see that really burst onto the scene, but has been going on for, you know, decades and decades. These policy changes are, or potential policy changes, are very important. A couple of other specific items. You could eliminate brokers' fees for tenants that act as a barrier to people with vouchers. Other practices that landlords sometimes do, they ask for deposits up front. They're making it very difficult for somebody who's low income to actually be able to participate in seeing that housing. Increasing funding for the type of thing that we do, testing and enforcement, is something that's very important. Another idea that we've been working on is amending the wiretap statute so that our testers can actually literally record the experiences that they have. And in Massachusetts, you have to have consent. Both parties have to agree to record, or it has to be obvious you're recording. And so there are exceptions for law enforcement. There should be an exception for testers. And I also think that looking at streamlining the process for vouchers is important as well. There's no reason why these processes shouldn't be looked at and streamlined so that they're made easier for people to access.
Thank you, Bill. I want to turn to James before we look at some of the audience questions and bring those in. James, Bill mentioned penalties and training. Is there anything else that you, from your enforcement perspective, that can be done to prevent this kind of discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bill touched on a lot of the things that can be done. And, I think one of the undercurrents in both the study and what we see in practice is that, discrimination is often happening in subtle ways. So, making sure that the existing laws have teeth and to increase resources for both testing and enforcement. So making sure that there are sufficient resources to both investigate and litigate fair housing complaints. And, the city of Boston's Fair Housing Equity actually reached out to us after the results of this study to do a partnership to do systemic and complaint-based testing. So that should hopefully increase capacity to combat discriminatory practices in the Boston rental market. So we're excited about that.
That's great. That's great news. I think there may also be owners who actually want to do the right thing, and I think training and being able to share best practices with them would also be helpful. We have certainly heard that from some folks as well. So I want to now turn to some of our audience questions. There are some that have come in through the chat, and we got some through the registration process. So one of our questions, Sarai asked, can you discuss some of the policy recommendations you've considered to rectify the problem you've uncovered? I think we touched on a lot of those. Jamie, Catherine, if there are other things that you'd like to add, I'd throw that open, but I think we touched on a lot of those. Someone asks, is this an extension of redlining? And Bill, I know you talked about some of the policies, discriminatory policies from history, but do you see a connection there to the redlining practices?
Yes, I do. And as I mentioned before, redlining is one of the policies that cause segregation, and as a result caused wealth inequity, health inequity, educational inequity. So it's very much at the center of all that. And that's why it does relate to what we did, because if at the same time, people who might want to use a voucher, for example, for mobility's sake and to move to a different area, an area of more opportunity, if they want to do that, they're being prevented from doing that. So it's perpetuating the segregation. There was a study that Raj Chetty did at Harvard that shows that the same individual, you take them from a neighborhood to, for example, a neighborhood of better opportunity, unsurprisingly, but this was a study that they did, they found that over their lifetime, they have significantly improved outcomes in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of earning capacity, all the things that matter. So it's not the person, it's the opportunity for that person. And so discrimination is something that gets in the way of that. And it's, as I mentioned, it's really a cultural thing, and it's us. And so we all are part of this. And until we can stand up and acknowledge that and say that, we can't sit back and say, oh, it's wrong for someone else to shout racist things at a Red Sox game, but that's not me. That's us. It's all of us. And until we live in a community where that's stopped and that's unacceptable, we're still going to be having these problems.
That's right. And to think that the voucher program was designed and created as a way to provide those opportunities and to create sort of a level field for people with lower incomes, and the discrimination is preventing just that. James, from your experience with the one client on the South Shore, what do you see as, sort of the ugly head of redlining rearing its head again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly, suggests that there are systemic problems, where real estate professionals and property owners apparently, feel comfortable with violating anti-discrimination laws. So, I think some of the implications that Bill talked about is it's really about changing the culture. And, as real estate professionals in particular are, the gatekeepers to housing opportunities, they can be a force for good, and, help to make more diverse and inclusive communities.
I should say, Soni, also there was a study, I know that you're familiar with the Newsday study where they looked at sales practices in Long Island. And so there they found that brokers were steering. And so they were taking their African-American clients and suggesting that they go to neighborhoods that were historically or majority people of color, or subject to redlining and that kind of thing. So that's something that their study uncovered is still prevalent, at least in that area, and that is also an extension of those old policies.
For sure, absolutely. Another question Michael asks if the research group analyzed results of individuals renting out a second home in comparison to those from brokers. So I guess a small landlord or an individual with a second home versus a broker that's sort of the gatekeeper. I don't know if that's a question for Jamie or Catherine.
I'll take this one. The way we structured the study, we really wanted to replicate what a housing search would look like. So we did not really have a thumb on our scale or a direct hand in picking the apartments. We said, this is our range, this is our price, this is our size. Randomized lists of those apartments that met those criteria came from analysis group. And we just went down the list. We didn't want to have any influence on how we picked apartments. And what we found all sorts of apartments. We contacted large complexes, we contacted owner-occupied buildings, we contacted something in between. We did not keep track of how the differences played out based on the size of the apartment or whether it was owner-occupied, but we did, anecdotally I can say we did touch all of those kinds of properties. And regardless of whether the owner was involved or lived there, again, 184, I think it was, testers interacted with brokers. So whether it was owner-occupied or an owner's second home or what have you, there was almost always a broker in the mix. So I think, certainly an interesting area to look deeper in, but our evidence suggests that there really isn't a significant difference in the way this market is playing out for these different protected classes.
To me, at least, it seems to be becoming clear that the gatekeeper perhaps needs to be eliminated. And, you talked about that, Bill, maybe just eliminate broker fees and take that person out of the transaction. I think it's probably a factor of a really hot real estate market that owners can't afford to use a real estate broker. Often it's the renter that's paying the fee. And so there's no check on the ability for brokers to play that role. Another question that came in through the chat, this is for you, Jamie. While Jamie already indicated that the research group didn't want variables other than black and white in the study, can she speak to why? And was there a reason testing excluded races other than white and black?
Yeah, I'm really glad that somebody asked that, just because we were trying to go through our test design and our results so quickly that we didn't dive super deep into that. Every 10 years, HUD funds an Urban Institute study that's a nationwide survey of discrimination related to race and ethnic minorities. And so we know from those studies that happen every 10 years that the level of discrimination that people face varies by race and ethnicity, whether somebody's Asian or Black or brown or Latinx or white. And so what we were trying to do was isolate as many variables as possible. We would have loved to have included more variables, but that costs more money and it just greatly increases the capacity. And I think that there's a great need to further study how other race and ethnic minorities are treated related to our specific rental market in the Metro Boston area and voucher holders and that sort of thing. But that's why we did that, because we were trying to reduce the number of variables to as few as possible.
And I would say also, Soni, another type of discrimination that's often associated with voucher discrimination is familial status, just meaning your families, and particularly families with kids under 6 years old because of lead paint. So that's something also that we think cries out for studying, because we see that a lot. And we contemplated doing that in this go around, but in order to do it, we would have had to send 8 testers to each property. And so I think Catherine had she would have pulled out all of her hair, you know. It was hard, very difficult for her to manage 4. And that was really an amazing thing, you know, that she did and was able to accomplish. So some things that we would like to study, we have to put out for another time, but we have our list.
That's great. Ana, I don't know if you'd like to add anything there, just from perspective of Chelsea households and other ethnicities.
Well, as I mentioned before, this community is a community of immigrants, but I also mentioned that there is a lot of support in the community. We have a lot of organizations providing food for people that need it. Don't be afraid to go out and, you know, and to go to seek for, you know, help. Also, the City Hall has a lot of resources for the community. So, and, you know, the housing situation, the household people, that will be very, very difficult to alleviate, because, you know, they are forced to live, you know, and sharing apartments. So I don't think it's nothing we can do about that, but you know, there is a lot of support in the city of Chelsea. I have seen, you know, blocks of people lining up to get food, and the food is coming from different places. You know, I will say that every day is an organization providing food for people. I spoke with someone last week that husband and wife had lost the job. They work together. They are still without job. They are undocumented. And she told me, I've been eating because of food donations. So that.
Yeah, the city of Chelsea and so many nonprofits have really stepped up. So that is great to hear that there's help on the ground.
Yes.
We have a question from Lisa. Can you provide any strategies to help people overcome voucher discrimination? I am Black and have a disability that makes it harder to find safe housing. And I know we've touched on some of these, but here's a very specific question for someone with lived experience.
Yeah, you know, it's tough. I mean, our study showed extremely high levels of discrimination. I think what we tell the people that we work with when they're going out and starting the rental search process is having this knowledge of what the market is like is extremely helpful. So keep a record take notes, note who you talk to, keep the rental advertisements, save emails and text messages, record the dates of those conversations. And then if you do suspect that you were discriminated against or experiencing discrimination, contact an organization like ours, or there are a few others in our state that do fair housing work. Contact HUD or the MCAD and ask, run through what you're experiencing to see if there's any help that they can provide you or point you in the right direction. I mean, I wish I could say that there was some sort of magic pill to fix it. But I mean, as James talked about, his client searched for 2 years, before she found housing. I mean, I think it's very important to know what the market's like, to arm yourself and go in prepared. And then if you can, follow up, and get help if you are experiencing discrimination.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. I appreciate that. And that's a great last suggestion and advice to wrap up on. I want to thank all of you, our presenters, panelists, for being here and for discussing such an important issue, particularly at this time when we're seeing such a disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown households and the ongoing effects of the racialized police violence. Thank you for a great discussion, and the audience for participating. Be safe, and good night.